how you've been able to achieve new forms of synthetically designed antibiotics, issues which have been described in the BBC and headlines worldwide recently.
What we've done is basically use generative AI. We used it to actually come up with chemical compounds that we've never seen before. It's still very early days for AI. And our third real benefit was we were able to very effectively integrate human intelligence with machine intelligence. But as a professor and as a dad, I'm worried about the overuse of the tech. I've been teaching young folks as a professional for 35 years, and I've seen a consistent decline, I think, in their ability to critically think, innovate, take on challenges. And I attribute it to the smartphones, PCs, and probably social media.
This week, Professor Jim Collins, pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Graham.
So I think this is going to be a fascinating discussion, an extremely important one as well. You recently made headlines worldwide with some remarkable breakthroughs and an application of AI which I think is really important for people across the world to get to know about, to see, to understand, and how the use of AI can have a massive impact on humanity. And I don't think we've ever had anyone who quite so directly can demonstrate that that is possible, and how and why it's an indicator of how we should really think about AI as humans. So would you like to give me a little background and some of your CV, just to give some context to the listeners, viewers?
Yeah, so my background is I actually come from a technical family. My dad is an electrical engineer. My mom was a math teacher and was exposed to technical matters from the time of really being quite young, and became interested in biomedical engineering, in part because both of my grandfathers had become disabled. One went blind, one had a series of strokes, and this led me eventually to study medical engineering at the University of Oxford. And there really became intrigued on both biomechanics and neurocontrol, and had the opportunity to work with Ian Stewart at the University of Warwick at the time, where we introduced mathematical ideas from nonlinear dynamics to better understand how animals walk and well as humans walk, and how that could be extended to robots. My first decade as a professor, I focused on using nonlinear dynamics and ideas from statistical physics in the context of human biology and human medicine, really studying how people walk, run, and maintain balance. Most notably, we showed you could deliver small amounts of noise in the form of weak vibration to improve human balance control. And this could be done in the form of vibrating insoles. So we could improve the balance of a 20-year-old, but more stunningly, we could take the balance of a 75-year-old and make it as good as a 25-year-old. In the very late 90s, I made a shift into molecular biology. And we showed you could use engineering principles both to really begin to deconstruct a living cell to understand how it functions, contributing to the emerging then field of systems biology, but then also really thinking about how we could build circuits inside living cells from the bottom up, leading to what became synthetic biology. In the context of both, we became intrigued about how bacteria act and how they can be problems for us in humans. And starting about 20 years ago, we became intrigued of how engineering principles could give us insight into how antibiotics act and how we might come up with ways to boost our existing antibiotic arsenal. And then starting about 5 years ago, we shifted to see how we could use artificial intelligence in the context of both discovering new antibiotics to start, and then very recently showed we could use generative AI to design completely new antibiotics from scratch, ones we've never seen before.
It's incredibly fascinating. And as a British person, working with the NHS and having had a lot of my family have spent time in numerous hospitals across the UK, from a British perspective, and I can't speak for the rest of the world, but we're very, very familiar with the MRSA superbugs and the problems that's caused. And from a personal experience, I discussed this previously with how protocols and hospitals are are put together, designed, implemented specifically to avoid this problem. So the late Gino Strada, and he described to me the process of cleanliness and really the basics of how to build hospitals and medical institutions where you can counteract it, but sometimes it just gets through. It's not possible. And we're talking about complex organizations where the primary focus of the hospital is for the sick and the unwell. So you're constantly going to be in an environment which has a high probability, and people traveling in. It's an unfortunate position that it's part of the issue of operating as a hospital. Describe how you've been able to achieve new forms of synthetically designed antibiotics to counter that and the other issues which have been described in the BBC and headlines worldwide recently.
Yeah, so what we've done is basically use generative AI to design these new molecules. So many of the listeners and viewers of this podcast have used generative AI to create images or to create text. We used it to actually come up with chemical compounds that we've never seen before. And how we did it was that we initially created a training library, about 4,000 compounds or molecules that had properties that could make for interesting, maybe antibacterial compounds. We applied these to both Staph aureus, the microorganism underlying MRSA, which stands for methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, as well as gonorrhea. And in each case, looked to see which of those compounds exhibited antibacterial activity as evidenced by growth inhibition. We then took those training data and used them to begin to train AI models that could be trained to predict, could a molecule make for an interesting new antibiotic? In the case of generative AI, we then took really two different paths, because in each case, if you're going to create a molecule, a key question is, what's your starting point? We initially said, let's make it a little easier for the models by starting with what are called chemical fragments. So effectively substructures of a chemical molecule. In this case, we used our models to identify fragments of some number of atoms that were already predicted to potentially have antibacterial activity. And then we used two different generative AI approaches, one that introduced modifications and mutations to those fragments in a systematic way, and another to begin to decorate those fragments, adding atoms, bonds, substructures. And in each case, in each step, looking to see which could make for an interesting new antibiotic. The models came up with millions of interesting possibilities. We screened them to identify those that are predicted to be potentially the strongest from an antibacterial standpoint. We then had a series of additional filters that were worked into the AI model in our computational schemes. We want to make sure they're not toxic against human cells. We want to make sure they have drug-like properties. And most critically, we want to see with decent probability we could synthesize them. We then arrived at several hundred of these, began to shop them around to different biotechs that could synthesize compounds, and effectively they choked on the list. It was too big. The task was too complicated. And in the end, Artie Krishnan, a postdoc who led our effort, made contact with Etamine, a small chemical synthesis company based in Kiev, Ukraine, that actually said, hey, we could do this. And they came back and said, we could synthesize 40 of these compounds. In the end, they synthesized 24 of them for us, 7 of which were new antibiotics, and 2 of which we've now advanced through a series of additional in-dish experiments and mouse studies and mechanistic studies to go after MRSA and to go after multi-drug resistant gonorrhea really quite effectively. So it was a fairly long and arduous process, but one that was made easier by the really powerful creative tools of AI.
I think what you've just described there is some key points which I think would be of value to people developing anything in AI, irrespective of the particular sector. The critical thinking approach, and also the problem that you're solving. Now, in a pre-conversation, we've touched upon the antibiotic resistance crisis. So as a premise, would you like to elaborate on what is that? Where has it come about? What's the history of that? Because it's a real identification of the problem, and then your experience, your way of thinking, the people you're working with, the team you're working with, the willingness to solve that problem, how critical thinking has enabled you, and also the discipline of keeping at it and making the steps, being prepared to fail along the way in order to actually solve that key problem.
Yeah, so the antibiotic resistance issue is unfortunately a growing issue, effectively now a crisis. It's really arisen from the significant overuse and misuse of antibiotics, both by physicians, hospitals, and patients, as well as in the agricultural industry. And now, decade upon decade, we're seeing the growing incidence of bacterial pathogens that are no longer susceptible to antibiotics. They've become resistant. And to an earlier point in the show, the superbugs have taken over hospitals. Worst place to be when you're sick is a hospital. Get out as soon as you can because of these superbugs and other challenges. And now they're not limited to hospitals. They're in our childcare centers, they're in our athletic fields, they're in our universities, shopping centers, our communities. And that situation is unfortunately magnified because of the economic challenges of the antibiotic market. Very few biotech and pharma are still in the space, largely because it costs roughly about the same to make an antibiotic as it does a cancer drug or a blood pressure drug.
Right.
But you sell an antibiotic for a few dollars, take it acutely, maybe a single dose, or maybe for 5 days or 10 days, whereas a cancer drug or a blood pressure drug or any number of other drugs can be sold much more expensively, taken over many months, years, if not even for the rest of your life. And even in the worst case, you also have companies that are developing antibiotics that then get shelved to put up to face future resistance, and thus the companies can't even generate revenue. The UK has actually taken a big leadership role in addressing the antibiotic resistance crisis. I think probably the leading nation state for that. And both with national initiatives, media attention, and calling out. And my friend and colleague, Ara Darcy, is leading a new thing called the Fleming Initiative at Imperial College Medical School. And the UK has a long history in getting after bacterial infections. John Snow in the 1800s cracked the cholera epidemic in London by doing really first study in epidemiology. Alexander Fleming, 1928, discovered penicillin at Imperial College Medical School. In the early 40s, Howard Florey and others actually worked out ways to manufacture penicillin at the University of Oxford during World War II. So UK has led the way, and I think they're beginning to lead the way again. In our case, I think we've been able to make headway both using AI as a discovery tool going back 5 years ago and now as a design tool, I think for a few reasons in this space. One is that we can collect our own data to train the models and to test and validate the models. Two is that we really lucked out by having an amazing team of young people who are multilingual in an academic science sense, in that we have AI experts who can speak to our microbiologists. We have microbiologists who could speak to our AI experts. And so there's not a Tower of Babel. It's really groups with respective expertise that respect each other and can communicate. And then third, there's been a real excitement in the AI world for the AI scientists, kind of trying to do everything autonomously by the machine. I'm not a fan of this area, and that I think certainly in my world of biology, biotechnology, medicine, it's still very early days for AI. And our third real benefit was we were able to very effectively integrate human intelligence with machine intelligence. And through critical thinking, ask the right question at multiple points in our study and change the direction of that study based on what we saw, both from a challenge standpoint and an opportunity standpoint. And I think the machines will get there, but we don't yet know how to program in that recognition of serendipity and coupling that with expert content and experience.
Well, it's interesting, that particular point, the mission we've been on for the last decade, and we've developed a different form of AI we call the large geotemporal model, which is not transformer based. So as a podcast, we're looking at AI in business, and that's all different business. And I saw an article this morning from MIT, your own university, that 95% of pilots in enterprises for generative AI are proving to fail, because the approach, and this is where with what we've done with the LGM, it's about subject matter expertise across a business. I mean, we're dealing with risk and resilience and security and numerous other aspects of an organization. And the experience that someone builds up over their life, the key of that experience is knowing which questions to ask.
Yeah.
Now, there's two parts to it. The trust and truth element, where if you've given up the right to having structural integrity of the data, and or if you've given away the right of the questioning and the thought process to black box technology, if it's everything happens within the same place and you're simply an observer, then you effectively lose the right of control. At which point, how can you validate? How do you know what good and bad is? And you end up in a perpetual loop of getting lots of answers, but not knowing how you've come to those conclusions, why you've come to those conclusions, or what you're trying to achieve. So from the generalized basis of not generative AI specifically, but generalized AI, if you fill it with a huge amount of misinformation from a consumer perspective, there's a massive benefit to an individual extrapolating value of many topics and many perspectives which they otherwise wouldn't have. But the function of a business, and again, it could be a pharma company, a luxury brand company, anything, it exists to fulfill a function. And that function is by its very nature specific. And it's very much outcome driven. So the elements that you've just described there are actually, I would say, universal elements to how people should think about AI and the relationship between multiple different forms of artificial intelligence. And we don't believe necessarily one is good and one is bad. It's what's the capability of this particular type? What's the capability of that? What are we trying to achieve? Who's trying to achieve what? Even within the context of a company, one company probably has 10 departments, all with different roles, responsibilities, trying to achieve the objectives their function has the responsibility of achieving. As a consistent group, the company may have an outcome it's looking for, but they have to work together, and it's the human integration that has to be at the heart and center, and really getting, as you said, multilingual in the form of, well, if you've got an executive speaking to someone who just does AI, but that person in AI has come through university but never had life experience, has never productionized anything, doesn't know all the particular processes, then I think there's a bit of a false premise of what the future could be, should be. And I think we've got to revisit how we think about AI. I mean, to me, that would take me to some other elements of your history and how that even helped with the pandemic, reading, innovative diagnostics. I'm making sure I get the terminology right. But if you could just have a run through how you've approached that rapid diagnostics and how that spanned out to solve particular problems, and that process, what you learned from that has helped contribute to how you think about the adoption of technology to solve problems.
Yeah, and let me touch upon the point that you set up, and then I'll elaborate on what we've done in diagnostics. I think AI is an incredibly valuable thought partner when used well, and I think that in our space of innovative science, I think it's important for young people to recognize that innovation doesn't only occur at the inception of the project. That really, particularly in biology, nature doesn't yield her secrets easily. You need to innovate at each stage and be open to what the experiment shows you, and to possibly go into new and different directions, and not to be too wed to a particular hypothesis or bias. And it's very hard for young people to get beyond that. I think the machines yet haven't been trained to deal with that at all. And finally, to one of the points you bring up, I think it's also important to check, validate what's coming into them, what's going into the model, what's going out, that we get false comfort from an algorithm that will give us a number, but we don't often go back to check what led to that calculated number, and whether there were different assumptions on parameters or variables, or the data itself to fed in may be junky at various points. And it's important to go back to that to see what's there. And, in the innovative diagnostic space, it was interesting. We really got engaged now a little over a decade ago in the context of synthetic biology, this idea that you can use engineering principles to create synthetic gene circuits, other components that could be used to rewire living cells. My postdoc at the time, Keith Pardee, was beginning to play with cell-free systems. What is this? This is that you can open up a living cell and take the machinery of that living cell out of the cell and play with it in a test tube or petri dish. In this case, the machinery could be DNA or RNA, ribosomes, other molecular machines, nucleotides, amino acids, ATP, other molecules. It's been used since before I was born in molecular biology to get after different things, including RNA code. And Keith had the interesting idea to see what would happen if he took a synthetic gene circuit that we had made to function inside a living cell and put it in a cell-free system and spotted those onto paper and freeze dry them. What he found was that subsequent to the freeze drying, if he then rehydrated what had been freeze dried on paper, it became reactivated and could function on the paper as if it was in the test tube in the petri dish, as if it was inside the living cell. And he showed me this, and I was shocked. I said, oh my goodness, we can do so many different things with this. But notably, we got excited about the idea we can now create paper-based diagnostics. The idea that you could use engineered biological material captured in a very inexpensive piece of paper that could be freeze-dried, and now you don't need refrigeration. So anything that we have that has biological matter, food we eat, medicines, research materials, you need to refrigerate them, if not even freeze them. With the freeze drying, you don't have to. You can stick it in your pocket, get on a plane, go around the world, take it out and use it. You can stick it in just a regular envelope, send it around the world and use it, including stored in your desk for 2 years or more. And we realized, boy, you could open up now the opportunity to have really inexpensive diagnostics. And initially went after antimicrobial resistance to see if we could get answers for a doctor within that golden window of an hour or two before he or she needs to prescribe antibiotics. And Keith was able to show he could do that, give you an answer in about 20 minutes. And this was happening in the summer of 2014. And with Alex Green, another postdoc in our lab, co-supervised by Peng Yin, he and Keith came to my office and said, Jim, we'd like to try to use this to address the Ebola crisis, which had just broken out in a number of countries in Western Africa. I said, sure. And what they did was remarkable. In 12 hours, they designed, built, tested, and validated 24 different senses for Ebola, 12 for the Sudan strain, 12 for the Zaire strain, and could embed this in paper with control strips. And this got published in Cell, got a lot of excitement. By the time it came out, it wasn't needed for the crisis. And we then looked to see if we could develop an at-home flu test. And fast forward 16 months to January 2016, we received an email from MIT leadership asking who was working on Zika. So we then had a Zika outbreak at the time, as you may recall, again in a number of countries in Western Africa that was spreading to a number of countries in South America. And Keith and Alex had started their own faculty labs at the time. I called them on a Friday afternoon and said, should we do this? They said, yeah, and turned to members of my lab, postdocs and grad students, and a whole group said, yeah, we want to do this, and dropped what they were doing. And over the next couple months, we actually created a field-based Zika test that was deployed in 6 different countries as a research tool and surveillance tool during the outbreak. We're really proud on its impact and set us up to actually create similar systems for COVID, SARS-CoV-2. And working with then a startup that had been spun out of my lab and other labs called Shirley Biosciences, we developed the first kind of synthetic biology approved diagnostic for, in this case, SARS-CoV-2 that was CLIA lab based, and eventually developed a system that was used by 5 different global diagnostic firms around the world during the pandemic to get diagnostics. So it spoke to, in this case, how engineering biology can address innovation. We used AI a little bit from the standpoint of designing the sensors, but it was really using this now what I would say maturing field of synthetic biology to engineer very novel, innovative diagnostics.
And where do you think this will go from here? The next discoveries on the evolution of synthetic biology?
I think there's multiple directions where we're going. I think broadly, with each month, we're making biology more programmable. And we're moving some aspects of biology to being more of an engineering science. I think the real excitement, I think, will be in advances for using synthetic biology to address challenges in human health and challenges in planetary health. So in the human health, it's where I do think biology can really outcompete chemistry. And I've already spoken to in the diagnostics end, when you could readily design quite quickly inexpensive sensors that could be used to address outbreaks of emerging pathogens, as well as to look at more complex conditions like cancer and inflammatory bowel disease. We've been spearheading efforts now for close to 2 decades of also engineering microbes to serve as living therapeutics. We showed you could use this to address cholera infections. We've shown you could use this to prevent antibiotic-induced gut dysbiosis. We're now getting after a broad range of infectious diseases, looking at IBD, looking at tapping into the gut-brain axis. I work with a company that was spun out of our lab and Tim Liu's lab called Senti Biosciences that's engineering human cells as logic-gated cell therapies that are actually showing really promising early clinical results in treating various forms of cancer. On the planetary side, I think there's a whole host of schemes of addressing challenges in the ocean, for addressing and measuring diversity changes, as well as different marine organisms. And really a central challenge, I think, is also getting after plastic recycling and upcycling. And can one engineer microbes to do so? And I've been working with Ting Liu, a former postdoc of mine who's a professor at the University of Illinois, as well as Peter Nguyen, a senior scientist at the Wyss Institute at Harvard, where I run a lab, to do that thing. So can one program bacteria to break down plastics and upcycle them into fuels, commodity chemicals, and even foodstuffs for livestock?
Again, you've touched on another very, very valuable topic, which we as an organization in the day job, so to speak, have a huge focus on, which is understanding the world, which, to break that down into more simple terms, observing the climate, observing socioeconomic conditions, infrastructure, cause and effect across all the major, I think we look at 6 key components, which we then have numerous subcategories. So effectively sensing and saying within the context of the interest, and the interest is obviously can be any organization, how does it impact or affect them, but making a connection of everything together in the world, and saying, well, what happens when there's political unrest in certain areas? You end up with people being driven to IDP camps, refugee camps in particular areas. You have desertification, which is a major issue, pollution, which is a major issue, environmental change, which is happening in numerous directions across the world. Looking at the nutrient deficiency in soils. So then you're moving into the economy, and you're looking at how do you feed people across the world. Look at consumerism and how that's affecting and impacting the creation of plastics, the dependency in certain ways on oils, the move to green energies, but what's the impact environmentally on rare earth metals? I had numerous conversations with specialists in that field today, and it can sound like you're a little bit crazy talking about all sorts of different random things. But if we took the holistic view that everything in the world is connected, and actually things that happen in other areas, I think a good example of that consequentially is obviously the pandemic, and how people operated and worked and interacted with each other. We're still in a peculiar way, which is very different to pre-pandemic. But effectively, going back to some of the points you've just addressed there, sensing, any diagnostic sensing to track any particular circumstance happening worldwide can have a potential global effect. And if we've had one major pandemic in our lifetime, there's a possibility of others. And obviously we saw huge amounts of money going into diagnostic testing, understanding that, data being aggregated, and geopolitically we're seeing numerous countries going different directions. So perhaps it's created a lot of benefit, but geopolitically some places gone in other directions. Is there funding? Is there more direct knowledge and truth as a result of it? Perhaps there's a little bit less. Maybe there's a shorter attention span. And even we discuss with numerous educators the incredibly shortened attention span of more recent generations going into the workplace, how it's adversely impacted their education and how it's reducing critical thinking, because the convenience of question to answer has been collapsed to such a dramatic extent that the critical thinking of why, how, is in many ways lost. Equally, that's becoming more apparent. So those who can understand critical thinking can have such a competitive advantage. And it leaves the world in an interesting place where with the potential AI revolution, depending on where anyone would necessarily believe it actually is and where it can go, as an incredible time of opportunity, yet equally the opposite is true at the same time. And that would lead to, after my ramble, critical thinking on a global scale, and how you're looking at from an education perspective. How do you think AI can help with that?
It's interesting. Maybe I'll just firstly on the sensor notion, which I think you make a very important point. I think once we can measure something, we can then improve it, we can analyze it, we can control it. And I do think there's marvelous technology being developed to lead to low-cost sensors that I think can really be incorporated into our communities to improve things, whether it's traffic patterns, better sensors that are crosswalks or intersections, but as well as energy utilization. I think that in our lifetime, we've seen two big movements, certainly in the United States, towards recycling and towards reducing littering. But there's not information about energy utilization that I think could make a big difference to how young people and older people make decisions in their lives of what they choose. People have their Fitbits, they know how many steps they take, the calories, how well they're sleeping, but they don't know what kind of energy you're using. What's your air conditioner? What's your refrigerator? Did you leave the light on in your study? What's your car? What that flight you just took? And I think if we could use those sensitive information, we could address some of those larger issues you spoke to. Turning to that second on critical thinking and AI, I think AI, it's a fascinating time to see the tools that are being adopted increasingly so. And I'm a proponent. I think there's a lot of value, but as a professor and as a dad, I'm worried about the overuse of the tech, specifically smartphones and PCs by our young folks. I've been teaching young folks as a professional for 35 years, and I've seen a consistent decline, I think, in their ability to critically think, innovate, take on challenges. And I attribute it to the smartphones, PCs, and probably social media. I see a reluctance. Young people seem to be more interested in being an influencer than being an expert. And what's interesting as being an expert is that it's really the idea you can master content, you can master a skill, master a field. And there's real satisfaction in that. You don't need external validation of it. You achieve it through very hard work. And I think there's been a rejection of content and the value of content, the value of learning and storing content as an individual, because just dismiss, I can always look it up. And I think young folks are missing out on the innovative thrill of making connections between apparently disparate bodies of knowledge in one's own head to say, this may actually be related to this, or I could flip this around to there. And you really can't readily do that through search online. But you can do that in your head, where it maybe comes up when you're in the shower, out for a walk, or just relaxing in bed. Second is that I think that young folks aren't taking the time to spend time in their heads. That I travel by subway to here at MIT every day, and everybody's on their smartphones and either looking at pictures of food or cats, videos of cats, or playing games, versus just spending time in their head and thinking through, what did they experience today? What did they experience yesterday? What did they think about? What did they learn? How to reflect? And I think young folks are missing out on that opportunity, one, to be more comfortable in themselves, but also to really arrive at meaningful insight, meaningful innovation. And it's concerning to me. And I think the young folks who can put aside their machines in a disciplined manner will have a big edge over others, certainly in creative spaces.
I think it's actually beyond creative spaces. And if you look at the performance of, I mean, we've had former SAS guys on whose expertise has been training elite special forces.
Mhm.
And whilst that may sound completely different from talking about creativity, filmmaking, music, one of the things that was made clear to me was the people that become absolutely elite at in the special forces, the only difference between them and normal people is they have the discipline to do and not give up. That actually, far more people than you would ever imagine, if they applied themselves and they were willing to experience and push that little bit further, would be capable. So I think there's a massive amount of unrealized talent across every single walk of life. Again, do that head down, the assumption that you understand because you've seen a portrayal of it. Yet to experience something is far more enriching, and that becomes something, if we're talking about the future of AI, it becomes a truly multimodal experience. The sensation being in the rain, experiencing being at a football match as opposed to watching it on TV. Sometimes it is better to watch on TV, but if you've been there in real life on a cold winter's day around lots of people, you begin to experience even a, a walk in the countryside, wherever
Yeah.
that countryside is, to see, I'd mentioned to you before, the colors of seeing the Grand Canyon in real life at sunset and the scale. There is no picture I could ever Google that could give me the comprehension and that awe-inspiring lifetime memory of what that was like. And the more people are open to that, it gets the neurons going, and you associate the physical sensation, the visual sensation. I think the neuroplasticity that it drives is just absolutely unparalleled to looking at a screen. It's not even competitive. And those that can get enough of that to think it's simply a choice to then observe will be the people that, yeah, will excel far more than others, but also will make those connections. And
Yeah, I think you're right, Graham, and that and I pick up one of the threads there is that I think it's so important to know how to fail and how to deal with failure and be willing to fail. You don't want to fail, but you need to be willing to fail. And I think we make mistakes as educators by not allowing our students to fail. I think we make mistakes as parents by not allowing our kids to fail. Yeah, in my lab, we fail every day. The number of good ideas we have that don't work out in the lab are stunning. The great majority of our good ideas don't work. I tell young folks when they come in, I hope you have a lot of good ideas, a lot of ideas, because your good ones, likely or not, most of them aren't going to be very good. And I get very worried about the straight A student who hasn't had any kind of direct experience of failure and of life. And how do you deal with it? How do you be resilient, not give up, as you say? And I do think sports plays an interesting role there. And that no matter how good you are at a sport, you're going to fail on a pretty regular basis. The ball's not going to go in the net. You're going to let the ball in the net. You're going to miss the shot. You're going to not run as fast. You miss the putt. All these things, and I think there it's difficult to sanitize it so that you don't experience it. And in my world, the phrase I love is that the successful scientist is the person who can go from failure to failure with undiminished enthusiasm. You need to be confident that there's value to you can find that answer. And again, I think we've lost that adventuresome notion in a lot of young folks who I think have the talent, but they've been robbed of the life experiences that set them up well for this. I've been shaped much more so by my failures than my successes throughout my life, both as just a everyday citizen and even more critically as a scientist.
I think that's consistent of most successful people in life. And uh, understanding that relationship between thinking, creativity, and success in other areas. It's seeing things. It's having a different mindset. I mean, Steve Jobs was very much into typography. So, but people wouldn't necessarily associate the success of Apple with understanding lettering. But
Mm.
it's actually incredibly important because it was the core of the aesthetics to understand people want to interact and experience something that feels comfortable. It's an emotional reaction, and it's It's a form of enticing communication. And that rationale went through everything that ultimately made Apple successful. It was, I want to have that. I feel that
Mm.
there's a relationship with it as opposed to a typical grey PC box back in the day.
Yeah.
Um, Most success has uh, that mentality, but yeah, that ability to fail consistently, but to have the inquisitive mind and to consistently question and think, right, well, I want to achieve it. Nikola Tesla, um, the original, not the car company.
Yeah.
Look, looking at his life, incredibly fascinating,
Mm.
and it was just almost an obsession with why. How does this work? How can I test it? How can I validate it? And I suppose the external optics of success. I mean, I can see that you were asked by Barack Obama. You were appointed for the study of bioethical issues in 2010.
Mm.
I mean, reading through your list of things, it's quite remarkable. But I'm sure you didn't do it so you could get a big list of items. You were interested in solving the problem. You were interested and fascinated. And I'm sure for everything that is there, there's probably a huge amount more that didn't quite work out. It's like songwriting. You know, the average songwriter to get one album will write 300 to 500 songs, but
Yeah.
you don't hear the other ones.
Yeah. Yeah. No, right. They probably should introduce us with listing all the things we didn't get or all the failures we had to give better context for young folks. I love talking to young folks and share with them that, I should be in a fetal position in my office given the amount of things that have gone wrong and the challenges I face, but I'm not. And, I can't wait to get in here every day. And I know it's going to be hard, but I also know when we do have those successes, boy, it's one of the greatest feelings in the world when we've cracked a tough problem and or had that impact where maybe we helped change somebody's life.
It's rewarding because it's something that you'll then forever know has
Yeah.
worked. And I think being part of a team, that's the other element which perhaps social media has made it more about me.com and it's my perspective and how I look to other people. When actually the greatest successes, um, human successes, which are observed by others, and this is a key metric for what I always describe to people. And I've worked with a number of pop stars where people think that they are successful for one reason, but they
Mm.
see the net result of the hard work of an entire team and creating the narrative in the same way that uh, to be at a Michelin star restaurant, to have the incredible meal and the experience is very different from being the chef in the kitchen and the
Yeah.
entire team preparing what hopefully will be that perfect experience and the front of house staff to ensure that everything works and that that's a memorable 1 2 hours. Um, Everything that led to that point is is the hard work, but that's actually what makes it so valuable. If it's too easy, then it's probably doesn't feel that it's worth it.
Yeah, I think it's right. I mean, the problem really needs to be challenging to make it worth going after and, even a bit out of reach. I think your point to teams is spot on. I think so much of modern science is team based. I think it's challenging to put together those teams, finding the talent, matching the talent with leveraging their strengths with right personalities and mix. And then, I believe very much in distributing credit widely, valuing the contributions, always value whoever contributes significantly. And try to make it interesting, fun, and engaging to come in and take on these problems because boy, it's hard. You are going to fail more than you're going to succeed if you're pushing the envelope on really what we know, say in this case about biological systems.
And how would you then describe what you would consider good leadership?
I think it's truly multifaceted. I think probably at the highest levels, you really need to be authentic. I believe very much in both as intellectual leader and leader of others, in that you should know what you know and know what you don't know, and be confident in both. You should share with folks on what the concerns are, what the value is, be upfront with them. I think it's key to value and respect folks recognize that not everybody's the same. You can have flat organizations if it makes sense, but maybe it doesn't make sense. I think it's recognizing how the world works, how the teams work. And I work hard to try to address the challenge, the problems quickly so they don't fester, but also really trying to find a spot where people can make a difference and contribute. Now, I'm also in big part of training. I need to enhance that person, have them grow and learn. But you also, in that, you want to actually make people feel like they're contributing and they're making a difference. You don't want to artificially construct that. Within science's leadership, I think we made a lot of mistakes during the pandemic where we were not authentic. We weren't honest in what we knew, and we made things political. I think as a leader, you really don't want to be political unless you're a politician. But even there, I think you still want to address the challenges of the folks and take it on. Again, I think it's being real with folks, of telling them some things that they don't want to hear but need to hear. And I don't like having those conversations, but I will have them.
Well, I think that's the difference between a good leader and a bad leader. One who's willing to have the conversations which are uncomfortable.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say, but one of the interesting new challenges of leaders, I increasingly am finding that I need to encourage my young folks to focus.
Right.
And it's to grab them early where they seem to be veering off, and to say, no, let's come back here. And that's hard. And, it's hard to encourage them to focus and give them that goal. Boy, if you can focus and solve the problem, boy, there's going to be a reward. You're going to really be satisfied that we could have this impact in a meaningful way. But lack of focus is a growing problem. And so it's recognizing when they're not present and are not staying on path and pulling them in.
So with that in mind, the students you've been teaching, the people around you who are entering potential time of influence in all these respective fields, in 10 years' time, what would you be saying to people today to make sure that they have the optimal success in 10 years? And what would you hope artificial intelligence looks like, given in mind you have an element of influence within the scientific field?
That's interesting. And I think, now and in 10 years, I think for young people, I think I would encourage them really on three things. One is to read deeply and widely. So deeply in their field, but also widely across intellectual disciplines to be exposed. Two is to talk to many people within the field, but also outside the field. I mentioned at the outset, I did my graduate work at University of Oxford, and it was a fantastic environment to be part of the middle common room, our graduate common room, where I could meet folks across multiple disciplines at any time of the day to have a meaningful discussion, as well as I could then have tea time within my lab, both in the morning and the afternoon, to speak about challenges I was facing scientifically. We don't have enough of that in the United States. And I think as a scientist, but also broadly intellectual, talking with others about your ideas freely and to work out the challenges and to build on their positives is key. And then the three is to spend time every day inside your head and just reflect that, American society in particular, we're always do, getting things done. And boy, some of my more meaningful moments as a person is just doing nothing effectively, but really spending time in my head, reflecting, listening to music, going for a walk, going for a run. And I think we've lost that in modern times. That'd be my advice now. That would be my advice in 10 years. When I look at AI, I'm intrigued on the adoption and the breathless comments on things such as ChatGPT and related ones. Very impressive on what these models can do. There's a long way to go. I hope in 10 years that we'll see better and different models that can be used as thought partners, that better enable us to grapple with the complexity of biological data, chemical data, environmental data, human social data, to both be able to give us insights into the dynamics, but also causal understanding. I think there's not been as much causal. Of course, one person's causation is another person's correlation, but I do think causal AI will become more and more important to make the connections that enable us to get mechanistic insight into what caused such and such. I think could be quite exciting in my field and broader fields.
Mhm. I mean, that in many ways is at the core context, because I know in AI context has one meaning, the meaning we look at it from a more human perspective, context in the sense that what is our human relationship and the context of how we live, how we operate, what we're looking to do, and using AI in an observational manner, observing on scale. And observation, well, the context is observing all factors that influence in potentially a positive or negative way. And of course, the different people, positive and negative could be different. I mean, you could be thinking, we want to have a nice little event outside and it's going to be pouring down with rain. But if you've had a drought for a while and you're responsible for making sure the garden looks great, you need rain. So one man's good is another man's bad. And
Yes.
that on scale, on a global basis, and understanding the nuances of everywhere on Earth, then perhaps we can then have a very, very valuable reason to invest time and energy, thought and attention to things that we may think are relatively harmless, but are actually having a negative consequence elsewhere. So I think it has the ability to increase caring. Adversely, I think we have to be very conscious of the risk of being careless with our thoughts and absconding our responsibility of thinking.
Mm, mm. Yeah, well said. If there are young folks out there, I would just emphasize, I think it's a great time to be a young person. Certainly within the sciences, my space, so much to be discovered. I think many young people get the false impression from these thick textbooks that everything's been discovered. In my space of biology and medicine, I think we're at the very beginning where we're understanding is still just a sliver. And boy, I'd love to be 40 years younger and starting my career given the tools, given the opportunities. The world's on fire in different ways and in different aspects, but I hope young folks can find the hope and commit themselves to having an interesting life to make an impact.
I think that's very inspirational and very poignant. Jim, it has been an absolute pleasure.
Likewise, Graham, thanks for having me on.
Lovely. Thank you.